year 1884 bled heat onto the borderlands of the Arizona and New Mexico territories, a place where God seemed to have run out of water and color, leaving only red rock, scorched earth, and a sky the color of a bleached-out turquoise stone. In the heart of this desolation lay Dust Creek, a town that was less a community and more a truce held together by the shared need for whiskey and supplies. Here, the lines weren't drawn by fences but by the color of a man's skin and the God he prayed to. White ranchers, Mexican vaqueros, and the lingering shadows of the Apache people moved through the same dusty street, their orbits carefully managed to avoid collision, their distrust a palpable thing, thick as the grit that settled on everything. Into this simmering pot of suspicion rode Evelyn Hart. She was a widow, though the word felt too brittle, too final for a woman of 24 whose grief was still a raw, open wound. She came not for gold or land, but with a purpose that seemed laughably delicate in this harsh country, to teach children how to read. She was the daughter of a preacher, and she carried her father's faith like a shield. But beneath the high-necked collar of her gray traveling dress beat a heart that had learned the world's cruelty firsthand. Her husband, a young lieutenant full of fire and conviction, had been killed 2 years prior in a skirmish with an Apache war party. The memory was a ghost that walked beside her, whispering of savagery and loss, a constant reminder of the chasm that separated her world from the world of the red man. Her wagon, laden with slates, chalk, and precious books, creaked to a halt before the adobe-walled structure that served as Dust Creek's trading post. The place smelled of dust, cured leather, and cheap tobacco. As she began the arduous task of unhitching her weary horse, a bay mare named Patience, she felt the familiar weight of eyes on her. The men loafing on the shaded boardwalk fell silent, their gazes assessing her with a mixture of curiosity and a coarse, unspoken appraisal that made the skin on her neck prickle. She ignored them, her movements deliberate and focused. A small woman determined to carve out a space for herself in a land that chewed up and spat out the weak. That's when it happened. A sudden, sharp crack. The sound of a mule skinner's whip startled Patience. The mare's eyes went wide with terror, and she reared back, her powerful legs flailing. The harness tangled. The wagon lurched violently, and Evelyn was thrown off balance, her hand slipping from the bridle. She cried out, a small, sharp sound lost in the horse's panicked whinnies. The men on the boardwalk either froze or took a half-step back, unwilling to risk their necks for a stranger's horse. But from the deep shadows of the alleyway between the trading post and the blacksmith's, a figure moved. He didn't run, he flowed. A swift, silent current of motion. One moment, he was a shadow. The next, he was there, his presence a sudden, startling reality. He was tall and lean, built of sinew and bone, and he moved with the predatory grace of a desert cat. He wore scuffed leather trousers and a simple cotton shirt that did little to hide the hard muscle of his shoulders and back. His skin was the color of sun-baked copper, and his hair, black as a raven's wing, was tied back with a simple leather thong. He didn't speak a word to the horse. He simply placed himself in its path, his body a calm, unmovable obstacle. His hands, long-fingered and calloused, found the bridle with an unnerving certainty. He didn't fight the horse's panic, he absorbed it, his quiet strength a stark contrast to the animal's terror. For a long moment, it was a battle of wills, man against beast, played out in silence under the unforgiving sun. Then, slowly, Patience's frantic movements subsided. Her breathing slowed, and she stood trembling, her sides heaving, her trust fully surrendered to the man who held her. Only then did he turn his head, and his eyes met Evelyn's. They were the darkest eyes she had ever seen, set deep in a face carved by sun and hardship. They weren't the flat, dull eyes of the drunkards in the saloon. They were alive, intelligent, and they missed nothing. They saw right through the preacher's daughter, past the grieving widow, and into the frightened woman cowering within. The townsfolk called him Crow Eyes. And in that instant, Evelyn understood why. He looked at her with the unnerving, all-seeing gaze of a bird circling high above the earth. Nathan Crow-Eyes Loman was a man who lived between worlds, belonging to neither. His father had been a white trapper, his mother a woman of the Chiricahua Apache. He carried both bloodlines in his veins, and for that, he was accepted by none. To the white men, he was a half-breed, a savage to be watched and suspected. To the Apache, he was a reminder of a world that was encroaching, a world that had brought them nothing but broken treaties and death. He made his living as a hunter and a tracker, skills learned from his mother's people, selling pelts to the white man he silently despised. He was a man of few words, his silence a fortress built around a pain so deep it had become a part of him. Years ago, he had watched a posse of white militiamen, drunk on righteousness and whiskey, murder his mother for the crime of being Apache. On that day, as he buried her broken body with his bare hands, he had made a vow. He would never again trust the white man's world, and he would never, ever, touch a white woman. They were a symbol of the poison that had destroyed his life, and his vow was the only thing he had left to honor his mother's memory. Now, looking at this woman, this Evelyn Hart, with her pale skin, her wide, startled blue eyes, and the scent of soap and civilization clinging to her, he felt the foundations of that vow tremble. He saw the strength in the set of her jaw, the intelligence in her gaze, and the profound sadness that she tried so hard to hide. It was a dangerous combination. For Evelyn, the moment was just as unsettling. She had been taught to fear men like him. Her dead husband's letters were filled with descriptions of Apache warriors, brutal, godless savages. Yet the man before her had shown no brutality. He had shown a quiet competence, a calm strength that was both intimidating and strangely reassuring. There was nothing savage in his eyes, only a deep, weary intelligence and a profound, guarded sorrow that seemed to mirror her own. A spark jumped the chasm between them, a flash of recognition, of shared solitude in a hostile world. It was terrifying, and it was undeniably real. The spell was broken by the grating voice of the trading post owner, a portly man named Silas Croft. "Well, get your hands off that lady's horse. Loman, she don't need your kind of help." Nathan didn't so much as glance at Silas. His dark eyes held Evelyn's for a second longer, a silent, indecipherable message passing between them. Then, he gave the bridle a final, steadying pat, and turned away. He didn't wait for thanks. He didn't acknowledge anyone. He simply released the horse and melted back into the alleyway, disappearing as quickly and silently as he had appeared. He left behind a calmed horse, a stunned woman, and a street thick with renewed suspicion. Evelyn's heart was hammering against her ribs. She took a deep breath, the air thick with dust and the lingering wild scent of the man who had just saved her. She finished unhitching Patience, her hands trembling slightly. The whispers started almost immediately, slithering from the boardwalk like snakes in the dust. "That's Crow-Eyes. Best keep your distance from him. Ma'am, half-breed. Can't trust him. Smile at you in the day, slit your throat at night. What's a woman like her doing in a place like this anyway?" She ignored them, lifting her chin a fraction higher. She had faced down grief and despair. She would not be cowed by the petty prejudices of ignorant men. But as she led Patience to the livery stable, her thoughts were not on the gossiping townsfolk. They were on the silent man with the eyes of a crow. She replayed the moment over and over in her mind, the fluid grace of his movement, the confident strength in his hands, and the profound, aching loneliness she had seen in his gaze. Later that evening, as the sun set, painting the mesas in fiery shades of orange and purple, Evelyn sat in the small, bare room she had rented behind the church. She unpacked her books, the smooth, worn leather covers cool beneath her fingers. These books were her armor, her purpose. They represented order, knowledge, and a world far removed from the raw, untamed violence of the frontier. But her mind was not on the poetry of Keats or the prose of Hawthorne. It was on him. She knew, with a certainty that frightened her, that their encounter at the trading post was not an end, but a beginning. A seed had been planted in the barren ground of Dust Creek. A tension had been strung between two people from opposing worlds. Two souls wounded by the same conflict. The man who had vowed never to touch a white woman, and the woman who had every reason to hate the Apache had looked at each other, and in that single, silent glance, the first, fragile thread of a story had been woven, a story as dangerous and unpredictable as the land itself. Outside, the desert grew cold and dark, and the howl of a lone coyote echoed through the silent, watchful night. The days that followed settled into a rhythm dictated by the sun. It rose with a vengeance, bleaching the sky to a pale, hazy blue, and it set in a blaze of glory, leaving behind a profound and star-dusted silence. Evelyn opened her schoolhouse in the abandoned corner of the church, a single, stuffy room that she scrubbed and aired until it smelled of chalk dust and soap instead of disuse. Only a handful of children came at first to the blacksmith's shy son, 2 daughters of a poor Mexican farmer, and a boy whose father ran the saloon. Their parents were skeptical, but the promise of a free education was a lure few could afford to ignore in a land where every penny was earned with sweat and blood. Evelyn found a quiet satisfaction in the work, tracing the shape of an A with a small, calloused hand, sounding out the simple words in a primer. Seeing the spark of understanding in a child's eyes, these small victories were a balm on her wounded soul. She worked to keep her thoughts contained within those 4 adobe walls, to focus on this simple, worthy purpose. But in the quiet moments, her mind would drift back to the street, to the silent man with eyes like polished obsidian. She saw him sometimes from a distance, a fleeting figure at the edge of town, his rifle resting easy in the crook of his arm, a brace of rabbits or a quail slung over his shoulder. He never looked her way, but she felt his presence like a change in the air, a low hum of energy just beneath the surface of the town's lazy existence. The truce between them and the town's simmering prejudice was shattered on a blistering Tuesday afternoon. The heat was a physical weight, pressing down on Dust Creek, making tempers short and patience thin. Evelyn had just dismissed her pupils for the day when she heard raised voices from the direction of the general store. It was a common enough sound, usually a drunken argument over cards or coin, but this had a different edge to it. It was colder, sharper, drawn by a sense of unease. She walked to the end of the church's shaded portico. A small crowd had gathered. In the center, backed against the rough-hewn wall of the store, stood Nathan Lohman. Facing him were 4 men, their stances wide and aggressive. Their leader was Jedediah Stone, a rancher whose land bordered Apache territory and whose hatred for them was as vast and arid as his own acreage. He and his men wore the self-important air of an unofficial town militia, their hands resting on the pistols at their hips. "We found tracks near the north pasture," Stone was saying, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Shod ponies, leading east. Same place my cattle went missing last week. Apache tracks." He spat a wad of tobacco juice into the dust, dangerously close to Nathan's worn boots. "And my boy saw you 2 days ago. Lohman, up in the Red Mesas. Awfully close to their territory for a man who claims to live by the white man's dollar." Nathan said nothing. His face was a mask of stoic indifference, but Evelyn could see the tight line of his jaw, the tension in his powerful shoulders. He was cornered, outnumbered, and she knew that any sign of resistance, any hint of anger, would be the only excuse these men needed to unleash their venom. "Got nothing to say," Breed, another of the men, sneered. "Cat got your tongue, or maybe you were just swapping secrets with your kin, telling them which ranches were ripe for the picking." The accusation hung in the thick, stagnant air. It was baseless, fueled by years of fear and bigotry. But in Dust Creek, it was as good as a conviction. The crowd murmured, their faces a mixture of fear and grim satisfaction. They needed a scapegoat for their anxieties, and the silent, half-Apache man was the perfect target. Something inside Evelyn snapped. It was the same righteous fire she'd inherited from her preacher father, a deep-seated intolerance for injustice. She thought of the quiet competence with which Nathan had calmed her horse, the utter lack of malice in his actions, and she thought of her husband, who had died fighting men he called savages. Yet here were the so-called civilized men of her own race, acting like a pack of wolves. Before she could second-guess the impulse, she stepped out from the shade of the church into the blinding sunlight. Her heart hammered in her chest, but her voice, when she spoke, was clear and steady. "Mr. Stone." Every head turned. The sight of the preacher's daughter, the quiet widow, striding purposefully into the middle of their confrontation was so unexpected it stunned them into silence. Jedediah Stone looked at her, his expression a mix of surprise and annoyance. "Ma'am, this ain't your concern," he said, his tone a condescending attempt at chivalry. "Best you go on back inside." "It becomes my concern," Evelyn replied, stopping a few feet from the men, creating a clear space between them and their quarry, "when I hear a man being accused without a shred of proof." She looked directly at Stone, her blue eyes holding his gaze without flinching. "You say you found tracks. Did those tracks lead you to this man's door? Did you find your property in his possession?" Stone shifted, nonplussed. "Now, see here, Mrs. Hart. We know how these things work. He's a scout, a tracker. He passes information." "You assume he does," Evelyn corrected him, her voice ringing with an authority that belied her small frame. "You condemn him based on his blood and your own fear. I have lived in this town only a short while, but I have seen this man act. When my horse bolted, threatening to destroy my wagon and perhaps injure me, he was the only man here who acted not with his mouth, but with courage and sense. His actions showed more honor than I am hearing in your words now." A heavy silence fell over the street. She had publicly shamed them. To be called less honorable than a half-breed by a respectable white woman, a preacher's daughter no less, was a blow their crude pride could not easily absorb. Nathan's eyes, which had been fixed on the middle distance, flickered to her. For the briefest of moments, his mask of indifference cracked, and she saw a flash of raw, unguarded astonishment. Jedediah Stone's face turned a blotchy red. He was caught. He couldn't lay a hand on Nathan now without looking like a brute who'd been chastened by a woman. He couldn't argue with her without looking like a fool. "He ain't worth defending." "Ma'am," he grumbled, gesturing dismissively with his hand. "You're new here. You don't understand." He shot a final, venomous glare at Nathan. "We'll be watching you, Loman." With that, he and his men turned and stomped back toward the saloon, their boots kicking up angry puffs of dust. The crowd, sensing the drama was over, began to disperse, breaking into hushed, excited whispers. The town would be talking about this for weeks. Evelyn stood her ground until the street was nearly empty. She felt a tremor run through her. The delayed reaction to the adrenaline and fear. She looked at Nathan, who was still standing against the wall, his posture unchanged. His eyes were on her now, and their intensity was unnerving. He gave her a short, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of acknowledgement so subtle she might have imagined it. Then, he pushed himself off the wall and walked away, not toward the trading post or the edge of town, but down a narrow alley, vanishing once more into the shadows. That evening, as dusk settled over the desert, casting long, purple shadows from the saguaros, Evelyn was sweeping the floor of her small schoolroom. A soft sound from the doorway made her look up. Nathan Loman stood there, a silhouette against the fading light. He had approached so silently she hadn't heard a thing. She straightened up, her heart giving a sudden lurch. "Mr. Loman!" He stepped just inside the doorway, his eyes scanning the simple room, the neatly stacked books, the childish drawings tacked to the wall. He seemed out of place, a piece of the wild country that had wandered into her small, ordered world. "You shouldn't have done that," he said, His voice was low, a gravelly baritone she had never heard before. It held no warmth, only a flat statement of fact. "They were wrong," she answered simply, leaning the broom against a desk. "They had no right." "Right has little to do with it out here," he said, taking another step into the room. He stopped, keeping a careful distance between them. "You put yourself in danger. You made yourself a target. For me. I can take care of myself." The words were brave, but she knew they were only partly true. His dark eyes held hers, and for the first time she saw the conflict raging within them. She saw the ghost of gratitude warring with a deep, ingrained resentment. "They see you defend me. They'll start to talk. They'll say you're keeping company with me. They will ruin your name. They will stop sending their children to you. You will lose everything you came here to build." "Let them talk," she said, her chin lifting. A muscle tightened in his jaw. He seemed to be fighting a battle with himself, and the effort was visible in the rigid set of his shoulders. When he spoke again, his voice was rougher, laced with a harsh, painful honesty. "I don't touch women," he said, the words coming out clipped and final. "Especially not women like you." He looked away from her then, at the blackboard with its dusty alphabet. "But that doesn't mean I'm not grateful." The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. "I don't touch women." It was a vow, a wall he had built around himself, and she had just thrown herself against it. "Especially not women like you." It was a dismissal and, strangely, a compliment all at once. He was telling her she was part of a world he refused to enter, a world he held in contempt. Yet he was also acknowledging her decency. And then, the final, begrudging admission, his gratitude. It was the first crack in his fortress, a tiny admission of connection that he clearly regretted making. Before she could form a reply, he was gone. He turned and stepped back into the twilight, as silent as he had arrived, leaving her alone in the quiet schoolroom, his words echoing in the empty space. From that day on, something shifted between them. They still did not speak, but their paths began to cross in the small, necessary dramas of frontier life. When the rope on her well frayed and snapped, she awoke one morning to find a new one, expertly spliced and coiled, lying by the wellhead. When a pack of coyotes tore a hole in the crude fence behind the church, she found it mended the next day with tightly wrapped rawhide, far stronger than her own clumsy repairs would have been. Once, returning to her room after dark, she found the large, unmistakable tracks of a mountain lion in the dust near her doorstep, and beside them, Nathan's boot prints. He was watching over her, a silent, distant guardian. He was repaying his debt, honoring his gratitude from the far side of the wall he had built. And with every silent act of protection, with every collision of their separate worlds, Evelyn felt the pull of the man on the other side of that wall grow stronger, a dangerous, irresistible tide in the vast, lonely desert. The sun of 1884 became a merciless tyrant. Summer clamped down on the borderlands, wringing the last drops of moisture from the air and baking the earth into a network of deep, thirsty cracks. The trickle of water in Dust Creek's namesake waterway vanished, leaving a scar of bleached stones and dry mud. Cattle, bones jutting from their hides, dropped in the scorched pastures. And the price of a barrel of water at the trading post became more valuable than a pouch of silver. With the heat and the thirst came a more insidious affliction. Chirnar. Whispers slithered through the town like heat shimmer, telling of Apache war parties, driven from the high mountains by the drought, their raids growing bolder and more desperate. In this crucible of anxiety, Evelyn Hart became an object of intense scrutiny. Her public defense of Nathan Lohman had not been forgotten. It was mulled over on saloon porches and dissected over mending baskets, the story growing more embellished with each telling. The silent acts of assistance, the mended fence. The new well rope were noticed, the signs read by the town's suspicious eyes. They saw conspiracy and coincidence. The children still came to her school, but their parents' greetings became curt, their eyes holding a new, wary hardness. She was the woman who sided with the half-breed, a woman whose loyalties were now in question. She felt the chill of isolation settle around her, a cold counterpoint to the searing heat of the day. The town's simmering paranoia was given a badge and a gun with the arrival of Sheriff Clay Brennan. He rode into Dust Creek not on a tired trail horse, but on a magnificent black stallion that seemed to absorb the light around it. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 50s, with a face that looked as if it were carved from the same hard rock as the surrounding mesas. His eyes were a pale, cold blue, the color of a winter sky, and they missed nothing. He was law, order, an iron-willed authority rolled into one imposing figure, and the town council, desperate for a strong hand to quell their fears, had hired him out of Tucson. For Evelyn, his arrival was a personal cataclysm. Sheriff Clay Brennan was her father. Their reunion in front of her small adobe home was as brittle and dry as the world around them. He dismounted, his gaze sweeping over her modest dwelling, the makeshift school sign, his disapproval a palpable force. "Evelyn," he said, his voice flat, devoid of warmth, still playing at being a missionary. "Father," she replied, her own voice tight, "I wasn't aware you were coming." "There's talk of an Apache uprising. The territory is paying good money for sheriffs who aren't afraid to handle the problem," he stated, his eyes narrowing. "My problem is, I arrived to find my own daughter as the town gossip. I hear you've been keeping company with a half-wild tracker, a man they call Crow Eyes." "I keep company with no one," Evelyn said, her back stiffening. "I defended a man from a baseless accusation, a Christian act, I thought you might call it." His lip curled in a sneer. "There's nothing Christian about consorting with savages. You will stop this foolishness. You are a Brennan. You will act like it." His tone was not a request. It was a command. The same tone that had suffocated her for years and driven her to seek a life as far from his shadow as she could get. The next day, she saw her father speaking with Nathan. They were at the far end of the street, near the blacksmith's. She was too far to hear, but she didn't need to. She saw the way her father stood, radiating arrogant authority. And she saw Nathan's response. He was preternaturally still, his face unreadable, but his eyes, even from a distance, seemed to burn with a cold, pure hatred that startled her. It was a look of personal venom, far deeper than simple racial animosity. In that moment, an unnerving suspicion began to form in her mind. These two men had a history, a dark chapter written long before she ever set foot in Dust Creek. The world chose that week to spiral into violence. Evelyn had ridden patients a few miles out of town, following the dry creek bed in search of willow bark. Known for its ability to soothe fevers, a useful remedy with two of her students now sick from the bad water. The silence of the desert was absolute, broken only by the plod of the mare's hooves on the sandy ground. They came out of a rocky arroyo, 3 of them, their faces masked by dirty bandanas. They were not Apache. Their Spanish curses and silver-inlaid pistol belts marked them as Mexican bandits. They moved with a swift, predatory confidence. One grabbed Patience's bridle, his grimy hand clamping over the horse's muzzle. The other 2 were on Evelyn in an instant, dragging her from the saddle. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She fought, kicking and scratching, but she was no match for their brute strength. One of them laughed, a ugly, guttural sound, as he ripped the sleeve of her dress. The world seemed to shrink to a vortex of dust, leering eyes, and the foul stench of sweat and unwashed bodies. A sound, like the whisper of a hawk's wings, cut through her terror. It was the hiss of a thrown knife. The man holding her arm grunted, a look of shocked surprise on his face, before he crumpled to the ground, a bone-handled blade buried deep in his back. Nathan Lohman emerged from the rocks above the arroyo, a rifle in one hand. He didn't shout or issue a challenge. He was simply there, a specter of vengeance. The bandit holding her horse cursed and drew his pistol, but Nathan was already moving. Dropping from the ledge in a controlled slide, He fired the rifle from his hip. The shot was a single, deafening crack, and the second man was thrown backward, a dark stain spreading on his chest. The last bandit, the one whose partner Nathan had just killed, let out a roar of rage. He shoved Evelyn aside and charged, drawing a long, wicked-looking blade. Nathan dropped his rifle and met the charge, his own knife seeming to appear from nowhere. The two men came together in a blur of desperate, deadly motion. It was not a fight of fists. It was a dance of death, silent save for the scrape of boots on gravel and the sharp, metallic ring of blade striking blade. It was over in seconds. Nathan was faster, more fluid. He moved with the deadly economy of a hunter. A feint, a sidestep, and his blade slid under the bandit's ribs. The man gasped, his eyes wide, and fell. Silence returned, thick and heavy, smelling of gunpowder and blood. Evelyn was on the ground, shaking, her breath coming in ragged sobs. Nathan stood over the body of his final opponent, his chest heaving. He turned to her, his face grim, and took a step. Then he faltered, a hand going to his side, and she saw the dark, wet patch spreading across his leather shirt. The last bandit's blade had found its mark. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice strained. She scrambled to her feet, her own terror forgotten. You're bleeding." He looked down at his side as if noticing it for the first time. "It's nothing." He tried to take another step and staggered, his face suddenly pale beneath its tan. "It is not nothing," she insisted, rushing to his side. She put a hand on his arm to steady him, and the contact was like a bolt of lightning. The muscle beneath her fingers was rigid as stone. He pulled away instinctively. "Don't!" The word was a harsh rasp. "You need help," she said, her voice pleading. "We can't go back to town. My father, Sheriff Brennan, he'd see you in chains, or worse, just for being in a fight." He knew she was right. Brennan would use any excuse. He looked around, his eyes scanning the terrain, his tracker's mind assessing the situation despite the pain. "There's no cover here. They'll have seen the buzzards by morning." "My home," she said, the decision made in an instant. "It's isolated. No one will come looking for you there." Getting him onto Patience's back was an agonizing ordeal. He refused her help, his pride a raw, stubborn thing. But he nearly collapsed twice. The ride back was a slow, torturous journey under the rising moon. He was silent, slumped forward, his breathing growing more shallow. Inside her small, two-room adobe house, she helped him to the simple cot in the corner. The air was thick with the coppery smell of his blood. With trembling hands, she lit a lantern, the soft glow illuminating the stark reality of his wound. It was a deep, vicious gash along his left side. "I have to clean it," she said softly. "The shirt has to come off." He didn't protest, too weak or too resigned. He sat on the edge of the cot as she gently worked the blood-stiffened material up and over his head. And then he was bare-chested in the lantern light, and the sight made her breath catch in her throat. His body was a map of old scars, a testament to a life of violence and survival. But it was his living skin, the heat radiating from it, the faint tremor that ran through him as her fingers brushed his side. That was so profoundly unsettling. She worked with a focused intensity, using the willow bark tea to clean the wound. Her touch was gentle, clinical, but every point of contact was charged with a tension that was almost unbearable. She felt the shudders that racked his body, tremors that had nothing to do with the cold. He was fighting, she realized, not just the pain of the wound, but the simple fact of her touch. His vow was a living thing inside him, and her hands were a heresy against it. He began to murmur, his mind clouded by fever and pain. The words were in a language she didn't understand, the soft, guttural sounds of the Apache tongue. He said a name, over and over, "Nalin, Nalin." "Who is Nalin?" she whispered, dabbing at the edges of the cut. His eyes, glazed with fever, fluttered open. He seemed to look through her, My mother. He breathed, the words a ghost of a sound. The white men. Brennan. Their hands were covered in it. He lapsed back into his own language, his body rigid with the memory. And there it was, the final, terrible piece of the puzzle. Brennan. Her father. Her mind reeled, the cold hatred she'd seen in his eyes, his warning to her. His vow had all crashed down on her with horrifying clarity. Her father had not just fought the Apache. He had been part of the atrocity that had forged the man now lying wounded in her bed. This man who had saved her life was sworn to hate everything her blood represented, and with good reason. She finished bandaging the wound, her hands moving with a new, somber purpose. He was quiet now, his breathing shallow but even. She pulled a thin blanket over him, her fingers hesitating for a moment as they brushed the hair from his forehead. He didn't flinch. The fever, or sheer exhaustion, had finally overcome his defenses. She sat in the single wooden chair beside the cot for the rest of the night, the lantern casting long, dancing shadows on the wall. Outside, the desert was silent. Inside, the world had been irrevocably altered. He had broken his silence and shared the root of his pain, and she had touched him, her hands ministering to the wound inflicted in her defense. His vow was not broken, but she could feel it straining, a tether stretched to its absolute limit, and she knew, as she watched him sleep, that she was no longer just a spectator to his pain. She was now a part of it, bound to him by blood, secrets, and a debt that could never be repaid. The days that followed were a strange, suspended reality. Time was measured not by the sun, but by the rhythm of Nathan's healing. Evelyn's small home, once her solitary sanctuary, became a shared space so intimate it was almost suffocating. Every sound was magnified, the soft rustle of her skirts as she moved about the room, the shallow rasp of his breathing from the cot, the drip of water from the olla she kept in the corner. They spoke little, their communication a language of gestures and shared glances. When she brought him a bowl of thin broth, his nod was thanks enough. When she changed the dressing on his side, his rigid stillness and the tightening of his jaw spoke volumes of the war being waged within him. Her touch was a torment to him. He could feel the vow he had made over his mother's grave screaming in protest every time her gentle, capable fingers brushed his skin. He would turn his face to the adobe wall, focusing on the cracks in the mud, trying to transport himself away from the clean, feminine scent of her, from the warmth of her presence that was a constant, agonizing temptation. She was the embodiment of the world that had taken everything from him, the world of her father, Clay Brennan. Yet, she had saved him. She was tending to him with a quiet, fierce dedication that defied everything he had forced himself to believe. For Evelyn, the knowledge of her father's crime was a poison seeping into the foundations of her world. Every memory of him, his stern lectures on morality, his iron-fisted sense of justice was now coated in a layer of horrifying hypocrisy. She looked at the scars that mapped Nathan's body and saw her father's legacy written in flesh. The man on her cot was not a savage. He was a survivor, and she, unwittingly, was the daughter of his tormentor. The guilt was a heavy, suffocating blanket. Her father came twice, the first time. Nathan was still weak, lost in a feverish sleep. Brennan stood in her doorway, his large frame blocking the light, his cold eyes sweeping the small room. "The bandits who attacked you were found," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Dead. One was killed with a rifle, the other two with a knife. A professional job." He paused, his gaze lingering on the cot in the corner. "Looks like you've taken in a sick child." "One of my students," Evelyn lied, her heart pounding against her ribs. "Fever from the bad water. His family is out of town." Brennan's eyes narrowed, but he didn't press the issue. There was a fourth set of tracks, a man who fought the bandits. He was wounded, bleeding. The trail led in this direction, then vanished. If you see or hear anything about a wounded man, you will come to me. understand."
"Of course, Father," she said, her voice a reedy whisper.
The second time he came, 2 days later, Nathan was awake. He heard Brennan's heavy boots on the hard-packed earth outside. In an instant, he was off the cot, his hand instinctively reaching for the knife Evelyn had cleaned and placed by his bedside. His wound protested with a sharp, searing pain, but he ignored it.
"Get back,"
she hissed, pushing him gently but firmly toward the small pantry. "He can't find you here." Nathan hesitated, his pride warring with the cold, hard logic of survival. He saw the genuine fear in her eyes, fear for him, and it did something to him that no threat ever could. He relented, slipping into the dark, cramped space just as his nemesis, the architect of his life's pain, stepped into the room. The conversation was short, brutal. Brennan informed Evelyn that he was placing a deputy to watch the edge of town. "The half-breed Loman hasn't been seen since the day of the attack," he said, his voice laced with suspicion. "Jedediah Stone says he was always watching you. If he comes to you for help, you will remember where your loyalty lies." When he was gone, Nathan emerged from the pantry, his face a mask of cold fury. "He knows," he said, his voice a low growl, "or he suspects enough to make no difference. We can't stay here." "You're not healed," she protested. "You can barely stand." "I can ride," he countered, his eyes burning with an intensity that silenced her. "It's better to die in the desert than to be put in a cage by him." That night, under the sliver of a waning moon, they fled. Evelyn packed a small bag with dried meat, a water skin, and a remaining bandages. Nathan, moving with a stiff, painful grace, saddled Patience. He refused to ride the mare, insisting she needed her strength for Evelyn. He would walk alongside. They slipped out of Dust Creek like ghosts, two solitary figures moving into the vast, indifferent darkness of the desert. For 2 days they traveled, moving south toward the jagged peaks of the Dragoon Mountains, a place where the law of men like Clay Brennan held little sway. Nathan's stamina was superhuman, but Evelyn could see the toll the journey was taking. The wound on his side had begun to seep again, and his face was drawn and tight with constant pain. Yet he never complained. He navigated by the stars, finding hidden seeps of water she would never have seen, his knowledge of the brutal landscape their only shield. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, the sky turned a strange, bruised yellow. The air grew still and heavy, charged with an oppressive energy. Nathan stopped, sniffing the air like an animal. "Sandstorm," he said, his voice grim. "A bad one. We need shelter. Now." He led her not to a cave or an outcropping, but to a place that looked like nothing more than a shallow depression in the ground, a place where the earth had sunk around the roots of a long-dead ironwood tree. "Here," he commanded, his voice sharp. "Get down. Cover your face." He pulled the blanket from her saddle roll and, with a few deft movements of his knife, propped it up against the gnarled roots, creating a crude, shallow lean-to. The wind came moments later, a low moan that grew into a deafening, sand-filled roar. The world beyond their small shelter dissolved into a swirling chaos of grit and fury. The sun vanished. The sky was gone. There was only the wind and the stinging, blinding sand. Nathan positioned himself in front of her, his body taking the brunt of the storm's fury. He was a living wall, shielding her from the worst of the abrasive wind. Sand plastered his hair, his skin, his clothes. Evelyn huddled behind him, her face buried in her arms, listening to the terrifying symphony of the storm. It felt like the end of the world, as if the desert itself was trying to scour them from existence. For what felt like an eternity, they remained that way, two small specks of life against the raw power of nature. And in that maelstrom, all the barriers between them were stripped away. There was no white woman, no half Apache. There was only a man protecting a woman, a shared, desperate fight for survival. He had saved her life yet again, Not from the cruelty of men, but from the wrath of the land itself. The storm passed as suddenly as it had arrived. The wind died down to a whisper, leaving behind an eerie, profound silence. The world was remade. The landscape softened and sculpted into new, unfamiliar shapes by the sand. The air was cool and clean, and the sky, when it reappeared, was a deep, velvet black, utterly devoid of a moon. The stars glittered with a fierce, cold intensity, scattered like diamond dust on a dark cloth. They were both covered in a fine layer of sand. It was in their hair, their mouths, their clothes. Evelyn's dress, a sturdy but worn cotton, had been shredded in places by the force of the wind, the fabric thin and torn along the sleeves and shoulders. She felt the grit against her skin, a constant, uncomfortable reminder of their ordeal. Nathan pushed himself up, shaking the sand from his hair. He looked at her, his dark eyes searching her face in the starlight. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she breathed, her voice hoarse. "Thanks to you." He simply nodded, his gaze dropping away as if her gratitude made him uncomfortable. He turned to check on Patience, who stood nearby, Patient as her name, her coat dusted with sand. Evelyn watched him, and something inside her shifted. It was a profound, seismic change. The world she had known, with its rigid rules, its prejudices, its clear lines between right and wrong, had been a lie. Her father, the symbol of that world's law, was a murderer. This man, the outcast, the savage her husband had died fighting, had shown her more honor, more courage, and more selfless protection than any civilized man she had ever known. He had saved her from her horse, from bandits, from the desert itself, and all the while, he held himself apart, bound by a vow made in grief and hatred for her people, a vow that had nothing to do with her. She stood up, the movement slow, deliberate. The torn, sand-filled dress felt like a costume from another life, a life that no longer fit. She needed to break through that wall of his, not with words, but with an act of pure, undeniable trust. She needed to show him that she was not her father's daughter, not a symbol of his pain, but a woman standing before him, free and of her own will. His back was to her as he soothed the horse. "Nathan," she said, her voice quiet but clear in the vast silence. He turned, and he froze. Slowly, her hands went to the buttons at her collar. Her fingers, though trembling slightly, were steady. She undid the first one, then the next. She wasn't trying to entice. This was not an act of seduction. It was a ceremony. She was deliberately, symbolically, shedding the last remnants of the world that had tried to define them both. The grit-filled, tattered dress was the uniform of that world, and she was casting it aside. She pulled the ruined fabric from her shoulders, letting it fall to the sand at her feet, leaving her standing before him in her simple, white chemise. In the cold starlight, her skin seemed to glow. She saw the war ignite in his eyes. It was a violent, terrible conflict. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, the knuckles white. His whole body went rigid, a statue of pure, agonized restraint. He took a half-step back, as if she were a flame that might consume him. "You made a vow," she said, her voice still quiet, yet carrying the weight of everything they had been through. "You swore you would not touch a woman of my people." She took a step toward him, closing the distance he had tried to create. "But what if I want you to touch me?" The question hung between them, a challenge and a plea. It was an offering of trust so absolute it was terrifying. She was giving him all the power, laying her vulnerability, her reputation, her very self at his feet. He looked at her, and his face was a mask of torment. She could see the ghost of his mother, the memory of the blood, the hatred that had been his shield for so long. But he was also seeing her Evelyn, the woman who had faced down a mob for him, the woman who had tended his wound, the woman who now stood before him in the heart of the desert, offering a salvation he never believed he deserved. His breath came out in a harsh, shuddering gasp. The vow, forged in the fires of hatred, was finally cracking under the impossible weight of a pure, selfless trust. He was the alpha Apache who never touched women, the hunter, the survivor, the man who had walled off his heart with stone and thorns. And he couldn't resist. He couldn't fight this. He moved. It was just one step, but it was the longest journey of his life. He crossed the chasm of race, of hatred, of memory. He raised a hand, the calloused fingers trembling, and gently, reverently, touched her face. His thumb brushed across her cheekbone, wiping away a grain of sand. The contact was electric, a shock that jolted them both. The vow shattered into a million pieces, its power lost to the desert night. He pulled her to him, not with force, but with a deep, aching need that mirrored her own. His other hand came up to cradle her head, his fingers burying themselves in her sand-dusted hair. He was the cracked, thirsty earth of the desert, and she was the impossible, life-giving rain. In the moonless dark, surrounded by a world that would see them both destroyed. Two people who should have been enemies found a sanctuary not in a place, but in each other. The days that followed the storm were a fragile peace, a stolen moment of existence in a world that had forgotten them. They found shelter in a hidden canyon, a narrow slash in the rock with a spring-fed pool and enough greenery to sustain patience. For the first time, the wall between them was gone, replaced by a quiet, profound intimacy. They spoke of things they had never told another soul. Nathan, his voice a low murmur in the firelight, told her of his mother, Nalin, a woman who could read the stories in the stars and who taught him the names of the desert plants. He spoke of the massacre not with hatred, but with a deep, hollow ache that had never healed. He described how Brennan, then a captain in the territorial militia, had led the charge, his face a mask of cold righteousness, and how he, a boy of 15, had hidden in the rocks and watched his world burn. In turn, Evelyn spoke of her own gilded cage. She told him of a childhood suffocated by her father's rigid piety, of a lonely marriage to a young soldier she had respected but never truly loved, a man who had seen the Apache only as a faceless enemy to be conquered. In this hidden canyon, they were not a half-breed and a white woman, not the hunter and the preacher's daughter. They were simply Nathan and Evelyn, two people whose scars, though different in origin, resonated with a shared understanding. His touch was no longer a torment but a reassurance, a silent language that said more than words ever could. Her presence was not a reminder of his loss, but a promise of a future he had never dared to imagine. But the peace was a mirage, destined to be scattered by the first harsh wind. Clay Brennan was a relentless man. Hatred and a wounded sense of patriarchal pride were powerful motivators. He had not given up the hunt. He followed the trail south, a cold fury burning in his gut. The sandstorm that had nearly killed them had also wiped their tracks. But it could not erase every sign. A man like Brennan, or the skilled Pima scouts he employed, could read the subtlest shifts in the landscape. A single, overturned stone, a bruised sprig of creosote bush, it was enough. They were discovered at dawn. The first sign was a flicker of movement on the canyon rim, a silhouette against the rising sun. Nathan was awake in an instant, his body coiled and alert. He had been a fugitive for too long not to recognize the posture of a hunter. "They've found us," he said, his voice a low, urgent whisper. "Get dressed. Take the horse. Ride west and don't look back." "I won't leave you," Evelyn said, her heart seizing with a cold dread. "This is my fight," he insisted, his eyes hard. "It always has been. He's not here for you. He's here for me. You're just his excuse." Gunshots echoed down the canyon walls, the bullets kicking up spurts of dust near their campfire. Brennan wasn't trying to kill them yet. He was corralling them, driving them deeper into the canyon where there was no escape. "Go!" Nathan roared, shoving the reins of patience into her hands. He gave the mare a hard slap on the rump, and the horse, startled, bolted down the narrow canyon floor. Nathan turned, his knife in one hand, and scrambled up the steep, rocky wall, a desperate gamble to draw their fire and lead them away from Evelyn. Evelyn clung to the saddle, her mind a whirlwind of terror. She could hear the shouts of the posse behind her, the sporadic crack of rifles. She risked a glance over her shoulder and saw Nathan, a fleeting dark shape against the red rock, moving with impossible speed. But he was limping. In his haste, he must have reopened his wound. She didn't get far. At the mouth of the canyon, 2 of her father's deputies were waiting. They grabbed Patience's bridle, their faces grim and determined. Moments later, her father rode up, his face a thunderous mask. He ignored her completely, his cold eyes fixed on the canyon wall where Nathan had disappeared. "He's wounded," Brennan barked to his men. "He won't get far. Spread out. I want him found." He finally turned his gaze on Evelyn, and the contempt in his eyes made her flinch. "You have shamed me. You have shamed your name." He grabbed her arm, his fingers biting into her flesh like a steel trap. "Your little adventure is over." He forced her to ride back to Dust Creek beside him, a prisoner under her own father's watch. As they crested the last mesa before the town, a column of dark, greasy smoke was rising into the clear blue sky. It was coming from the direction of the church. Evelyn's blood ran cold. It was her schoolhouse, or what was left of it. The small adobe room where she had found her purpose was a smoldering ruin. Flames still licked at the charred roof beams. The few benches and desks she had painstakingly acquired were now just piles of glowing embers. Her books, her precious slates, her students' clumsy drawings all reduced to ash. A small crowd of townspeople stood watching, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and grim satisfaction. This was justice. Their expressions seemed to say, "This is what happens when you defy the natural order of things." Brennan reined in his horse, forcing her to look. "Every tie you had to that savage is now severed," he said, his voice as cold and dead as the ashes before them. "You will live in my quarters at the jail. You will not speak to anyone. You will remember who you are." Nathan, meanwhile, had escaped. Pain was a white-hot fire in his side, but the will to survive, honed over a lifetime of persecution, was stronger. He used every trick his mother had taught him, doubling back on his own trail, using the rocky terrain to hide his passage until the sounds of the posse faded behind him. He was wounded, alone, and now a hunted man with a price on his head. But as he hid in a crevice and watched the smoke rise from Dust Creek, his pain transformed into a cold, diamond-hard resolve. Brennan hadn't just burned a building, he had declared war. When Evelyn was marched down the main street of Dust Creek, a captive of the new sheriff, the town's silent suspicion blossomed into open hostility. The women who had once given her cautious smiles now turned their backs. The men who had tipped their hats now stared at her with open scorn. Doors closed as she passed. Windows were shuttered. Whispers followed her like a plague. "The Apache woman, she lay with a savage. She's cursed, brought the devil into our town." She was no longer Mrs. Hart, the respectable schoolteacher. She was an outcast, a pariah, tainted by her association with the man they all feared and hated. Her father locked her in a small, barren room in the back of the sheriff's office, the single window barred. She was a prisoner in every sense of the word, isolated and alone, with nothing but the smoldering memory of her schoolhouse and the aching fear for Nathan's safety. For a week, Nathan journeyed into the high, secret places of the mountains, his body protesting every step. He followed signs that only he could read, patterns of stones and markings on trees that were a silent language among the scattered remnants of his mother's people. He found them in a hidden valley, a small, beleaguered band of Chiricahua, no more than a dozen families, their faces etched with hunger and despair. They were the survivors of countless massacres, the ghosts of a once proud nation, led by an old, weary chief named Taza. They took him in, tending to his wound. They listened as he told them of the growing fear in the white man's town, of the new sheriff whose name they knew all too well. "Brennan," Taza said, the name a bitter curse on his lips. "He is a man who hunts for sport. He will not be content until every one of us is in the ground." Nathan's fears were confirmed that evening. He spoke with a young Apache scout who had been watching Dust Creek from the hills. The scout spoke of new men arriving daily, hard-faced men with repeating rifles, answering a call for a new territorial militia. Brennan was not just building a posse to hunt one man. He was gathering an army. He was planning a final, decisive action. A sweep of the mountains to exterminate the last of the hostiles and make the territory safe for men like him. Nathan knew then that he could not run. His personal fight against Brennan had merged with a fight for his people's survival. He stood before the small council of elders, his wound tightly bound, his eyes burning with a new fire. "Brennan thinks we are weak, scattered," Nathan said, his voice resonating with a power they had not heard from him before. "He thinks we will hide and wait for him to slaughter us in our sleep, as he did before. But he is wrong. We will not wait for his fire. We will bring the fight to him." Back in Dust Creek, Evelyn discovered the true horror of her father's plan. Through the thin walls of her cell, she could hear his meetings. She heard him talking to Jedediah Stone and the other ranchers, his voice full of charismatic poison. He spoke of a final solution, of a cleansing of the territory. He wasn't just planning to attack a war party. He was planning to annihilate the families Nathan had gone to find, to wipe them from the face of the earth. She was now caught in an impossible position. She stood on one side of a battle line, Nathan on the other. Her own father was the architect of a coming massacre, and the man she loved was its target. Every instinct for self-preservation screamed at her to stay silent, to endure her imprisonment, to survive. But the memory of Nathan's touch, the sound of his voice speaking his mother's name, the sheer injustice of it all, it was a force more powerful than fear. Her love for him had broken her free from the prison of her old life, and now it demanded one final, terrifying act of rebellion. She would not be a passive victim. She would not be Clay Brennan's shamed daughter. Lying on her cot in the dark, she made a decision. She would fight back. She did not know how, but she knew she had to. She had to find a way to warn Nathan. She had to stop her father. Her loyalty was no longer to a name or a bloodline, but to a man, and to the desperate, impossible love that had bloomed in the heart of the desert. She would stand against her own father, even if it meant her own destruction. The night air in Dust Creek was thick with anticipation, carrying the scent of whiskey, sweat, and impending violence. From the barred window of her cell, Evelyn watched as the town transformed into a military camp. Her father, Sheriff Brennan, had assembled a force of nearly 50 men, hard-faced ranchers like Jedediah Stone, and hired guns drawn by the promise of territorial bounty money. They moved with a grim purpose, checking their rifles, filling their canteens, their voices low and coarse. They were preparing to ride out at moonrise, to enact her father's final solution. Time was running out. For 3 days, Evelyn had been a model prisoner. She ate the meager meals, spoke only when spoken to, and gave no sign of the furious resolve burning within her. Her compliance had bred contemptuous carelessness in her guard. A young deputy named Miller, who was more interested in the glory of the coming raid than in watching a disgraced woman. He would leave the tray of food just inside the door, the key to her cell hanging from a hook on the wall, tantalizingly close. Tonight was different. When Miller brought her food, his excitement made him sloppy. He was boasting about the fight to come, about the land that would be safe once and for all. As he turned to leave, his back to her, Evelyn acted with a speed born of pure desperation. She scooped a handful of sand and grit from the dusty floorboards, the same grit that had once covered her in the storm, and threw it directly into his face. The deputy cried out, his hands flying to his eyes, cursing and sputtering. It was the only opening she would get. She lunged for the door, her fingers closing around the cool iron of the key. He stumbled blindly, reaching for her, but she was already turning the lock. The mechanism clicked, a sound as loud as a gunshot in the small room. She slipped out, slamming the heavy wooden door behind her and, with a trembling hand, turned the key from the outside, locking her jailer in her own cell. She didn't run into the street. She was not a fool. Instead, she slipped into her father's office. It was empty, the chair pushed back, a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the desk. On the wall, a gun rack held several rifles and a holstered pistol. Without a second's hesitation, she took the pistol. It was heavy, cold, and felt utterly alien in her hand. She also took a box of cartridges, stuffing them into the pocket of her dress. Her plan was not to find Nathan. It was to stop the militia, and she knew how. Their strength was in their numbers and their firepower. Their weakness was their arrogance. She crept out the back of the sheriff's office, a ghost in the shadows. The militia's horses were tied at a long hitching rail in front of the saloon, but their pack mules laden with extra ammunition, dynamite for clearing rock falls, and supplies were in the livery stable. It was her target. The stable was dark and smelled of hay and manure. A single lantern cast a low, golden glow. She moved to the back, where the ammunition crates were stacked near piles of dry hay. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. This was the point of no return. Setting a fire was an act of war, but her father had already declared war on everything she held dear. With shaking hands, she held the lantern's flame to a loose bale of hay. It caught with a greedy, terrifying whoosh. Flames climbed the dry tinder in an instant, licking at the wooden walls. She didn't wait to see more. She turned and fled, melting back into the shadows as the first shouts of fire echoed through the town. High in the hills overlooking Dust Creek, Nathan and a small party of 20 Apache warriors watched the town. They were outnumbered more than 2 to 1, a desperate last-ditch force armed with a motley collection of old rifles, bows, and lances. Their plan was a suicidal one to attack the militia on the trail, to harry and slow them down, to buy their families enough time to flee deeper into the mountains. But as they prepared to move, a new, angry orange glow bloomed in the center of the town. "The livery stable," one of the warriors said, his voice a low hiss. Nathan stared, his tracker's mind racing. It was a diversion. It was too precise, too strategic to be an accident. It could only be one person. Evelyn. She was fighting back. She was trying to warn him, to help him. In that moment, his plan changed. Brennan's force was now distracted. In chaos, their supplies, their extra ammunition, were going up in flames. This was their chance. Not to run, not to delay, but to strike. "We don't attack them on the trail," Nathan said, his voice ringing with a cold, deadly authority. "We attack them now. We cut off the head of the snake." The night exploded. The Apache warriors descended from the hills like vengeful spirits, their war cries splitting the air. They were not aiming for a sustained battle, but for shock and terror. They swept through the disorganized clusters of militiamen, arrows flying from the darkness, their movements swift and ghostly. The militia, caught between the fire at their backs and the wraiths attacking from the front, panicked. The fight devolved into a chaotic, swirling melee in the single dusty street of Dust Creek. Evelyn, running from the livery, was thrown directly into the maelstrom. A militiaman, his face wild with fear, grabbed her, thinking her one of the attackers. She brought the heavy pistol down on the side of his head with all her strength. He crumpled, and she stood over him, breathing heavily, the gun now feeling like an extension of her own will to survive. She saw Nathan then. He was in the center of the fray, moving with a lethal grace, a phantom of death in the flickering firelight. He was not fighting with a rifle, but with a war club and a knife, his movements economical and deadly. He was protecting his people, fighting for their lives. Their eyes met across the chaos. And in that instant, the world narrowed to just the two of them. He was fighting his way toward her. And then she saw her father. Clay Brennan stood on the boardwalk in front of his office, his face a mask of incandescent rage. The fire, the attack, his daughter standing with a gun in her hand amidst the chaos. It was the ultimate, unforgivable betrayal. He raised his heavy Colt revolver, the barrel glinting in the firelight. He wasn't aiming at the warriors around him. He was aiming directly at Nathan. Time seemed to slow. Evelyn saw the set of her father's jaw, the cold fire in his eyes. She saw Nathan. His back momentarily turned as he fought off another attacker. She didn't think, she acted. "Nathan!" she screamed, and threw herself forward, shoving him hard. The world erupted in a flash of white-hot pain. She felt the impact in her shoulder, a brutal, tearing force that stole her breath and sent her staggering backward. She fell, the dusty ground rushing up to meet her. The sounds of the battle faded to a distant, hollow roar. Nathan turned, his face a mask of disbelief as he saw her fall. He looked from her crumpled form to her father, who stood on the boardwalk, the smoking pistol still in his hand. For a single, frozen moment, all the sound in the world seemed to die. The hatred that had fueled Nathan for 2 decades, the vow made over his mother's grave, the fresh, agonizing pain of seeing Evelyn shot at all coalesced into a single point of pure, cold clarity. This was not about revenge anymore. It was about an ending. It was about justice. He let out a cry, but it was not a cry of rage. It was a sound of profound, animalistic grief. He ignored the men around him and charged, his knife held low. Brennan fired again, but his hand was shaking with fury, and the shot went wide. Nathan was a blur, covering the distance between them in 3 long strides. He vaulted onto the boardwalk. The final confrontation was brutally short. Brennan tried to bring his pistol down as a club, but Nathan was too close, too fast. He deflected the blow, his other hand flashing out. The knife slid into Brennan's side, a swift, precise, and fatal thrust. Brennan's eyes went wide, a look of shocked surprise on his face. He looked down at the hilt of the knife protruding from his ribs, then back up at Nathan. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but only a wet, gurgling sound came out. He crumpled to his knees, then fell forward onto the dusty planks of the boardwalk, his reign of hatred finally over. Nathan didn't spare him a second glance. He was already turning, leaping off the boardwalk and rushing to Evelyn's side. The battle was already dying down, the remaining militia scattering into the darkness, the Apache warriors melting back toward the hills. Smoke and the smell of blood and fear choked the air. He knelt beside her, gathering her into his arms. Her face was pale in the firelight, her eyes clouded with pain. Her dress was stained with a dark, spreading patch of blood. "Evelyn," he breathed, his voice breaking. He pressed his hand against the wound, a futile attempt to stem the flow of her life. She looked up at him, a faint, pained smile touching her lips. The world was smoke and fire and chaos, but in his arms, she felt a strange sense of peace. He bent his head, his forehead resting against hers, his body trembling with uncontrollable sobs. "I kept my promise to my mother," he whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears, the words a confession torn from the deepest part of his soul. "I kept it for all these years, until I met you." She raised a weak hand, her fingers touching his cheek. Her voice was a fragile thread of sound against the crackling of the flames. "And I broke every rule my father taught me," she whispered back. "I threw away my name, my honor, my old life, just to love you." He held her tighter, as if he could pour his own strength into her, as if he could hold her back from the darkness that was pulling at the edges of her vision. The bloody night of Dust Creek was ending, leaving behind a legacy of ash and death. But in the heart of the inferno, a wounded man held the woman who had shattered his vow and remade his world, his love for her the only thing left that was real. Evelyn did not die. She hovered in a gray, pain-filled limbo for weeks, her life tethered to the mortal world by the thinnest of threads. Nathan, in the chaotic aftermath of the battle, had carried her not to her own home, but to the dusty office of Doc Hennessy, the town's perpetually drunk but surprisingly competent physician. He had laid her gently on the examination table, his knife held not as a threat, but as a grim promise. "Save her," he had said, his voice a raw whisper, before vanishing into the smoke-choked darkness just as the first terrified townsmen began to emerge from their homes. And Hennessy, motivated by some combination of his medical oath and the terrifying specter of the man they called Crow Eyes, had done just that. He had dug the bullet from her shoulder, stitched the torn flesh, and poured raw whiskey into the wound. A brutal act of healing that had likely saved her from the fever that followed. Dust Creek awoke the next morning, a broken, traumatized town. The livery stable was a skeletal ruin of blackened timbers. The bodies of 3 militiamen and Sheriff Brennan lay in the street under hastily draped blankets. The official story, cobbled together from fear and confusion, was a simple one. The half-breed Loman, leading a savage Apache war party, had attacked the town unprovoked. Sheriff Brennan had died a hero defending it, and his disgraced daughter, a traitor who had consorted with the enemy, had been caught in the crossfire. No one spoke of the planned massacre. No one spoke of the burned schoolhouse. The town, in its collective guilt and terror, needed a simple narrative of good versus evil, and Nathan and Evelyn were cast as the villains. A wanted poster appeared within a week, nailed to the door of the sheriff's office. It offered $500 for the capture, dead or alive, of Nathan Crow Eyes Loman, for the murder of a lawman and inciting a riot. His face, drawn from the fearful memories of the townsfolk, was a demonic caricature of a savage. Evelyn's recovery was a lonely ordeal. She healed in a small, spare room at the back of Hennessy's office, a prisoner of her own infamy. No one came to visit. When she was finally able to walk, her arm in a sling, her shoulder a constant, burning ache, she found herself utterly alone. The town that had once watched her with suspicion now shunned her with a cold, unified finality. When she walked down the street, conversations would cease. Women would pull their children close and hurry away. Men would stare through her as if she were a ghost. She was a living reminder of the night of blood and fire, a symbol of their fear and their shame. With her schoolhouse destroyed and her reputation in ashes, she had nothing. She sold her horse, Patience, and the wagon for a pittance, just enough to buy back her small adobe home from the church, whose deacons were only too happy to be rid of the property and its tainted association. She lived a life of profound silence, a hermit in the midst of a town that wished she would simply disappear. She survived by taking in sewing and mending, her needle-pricked fingers earning her just enough for flour and beans. The solitude was a heavy shroud, but she bore it. Her only comfort was the memory of the moonless night in the desert, the feeling of Nathan's arms around her, the truth of their shared love, a secret fire that warmed her against the world's cold judgment. Nathan, true to his word, had vanished into the mountains. He and the Chiricahua warriors had faded back into the landscape, becoming the ghosts the white men believed them to be. He was now a legend, a name whispered by frightened children and cursed by frustrated posies who would ride into the mountains in search of the $500 bounty, only to return weeks later, empty-handed, their horses lame, their spirits broken by a wilderness that seemed to actively conspire against them. Nathan's world was one of constant vigilance, of sleeping in hidden caves and drinking from secret springs. His life a lonely exile, but his spirit was not in the mountains. Every night, he would find a high vantage point, a ridge that overlooked the distant, hazy lights of Dust Creek, and he would watch, his heart aching with a love that was as constant and enduring as the stars above. It was nearly a year after the attack that the first sign appeared. Evelyn awoke one morning to a stillness that was unusual. As she stepped outside her door to fetch water, she saw it on her doorstep. 3 pieces of dried cholla cactus, their skeletal, woody forms carefully arranged in the delicate shape of a crescent moon. Her breath caught in her throat, and her hand flew to her mouth. It was a symbol only she would understand. The new moon, the moonless night, their night. It was a message, sent across an impossible distance, a whisper in a silent language. I am alive. I am watching. I remember. Tears streamed down her face. The first she had shed since that terrible night. They were tears of relief, of grief, of a love so profound it could cross the boundaries of exile and infamy. She carefully gathered the fragile pieces of cactus and took them inside, placing them on her mantle like a sacred relic. The signs continued, never predictably, but always when her hope began to fade. Sometimes months would pass. She would find them after a dust storm, or on the morning after a hard freeze. A crescent moon made of carefully chosen raven feathers, an arrangement of smooth, white river stones. Each one was a silent affirmation, a renewal of a bond that the world had tried to sever. They became her calendar, her seasons, her faith. They were the proof that she was not truly alone. Years passed. The silence became a way of life. Evelyn's dark hair began to show threads of silver, the lines on her face, etched by loneliness and quiet sorrow, deepened. The sharp edges of the town's animosity softened into a dull, ingrained habit of avoidance. She was no longer a scandal, but a fixture, a sad, strange woman who lived alone at the edge of town, a permanent ghost from its violent past. The world changed around her. The 1880s gave way to the 1890s. The long-awaited railroad finally snaked its way across the territory, its whistle a mournful, alien sound in the desert. A telegraph office opened next to the rebuilt livery, its staccato clicking a constant reminder of a larger, faster world that was encroaching on their isolation. Dust Creek grew. New families arrived, people who knew nothing of the night of fire and blood, who knew Evelyn only as the quiet seamstress with the sad eyes. The memory of Sheriff Brennan faded from heroic martyrdom into a name on a weathered wooden grave marker. The wanted poster for Nathan Lohman yellowed and tore in the wind, eventually disappearing altogether, its bounty never claimed. And in this new, changing world, the legend began. On the darkest nights, when the new moon was a void in the star-dusted sky, people would sometimes see a shadow detaching itself from the deep darkness of the surrounding desert. A tall, silent man who would walk not through the main street, but through the alleys and back ways, moving with a fluid grace that was not entirely human. He would go to the small adobe house at the edge of town, and the door would open for him without a sound. Local lore, passed down from the old-timers to the newcomers, gave the story its shape. It was the ghost of the Apache killer, they said, still haunting the woman who had betrayed her people for him. They were a cautionary tale, a piece of dark local folklore. But for Evelyn and Nathan, it was their life. On those moonless nights, their stolen hours were a sacred ritual. He would appear at her door, his face more deeply lined, his hair now streaked with gray, but his eyes holding the same fierce intelligence, the same deep, aching love. She would lead him inside, and for a few precious hours, the years of silence would fall away. They didn't speak of the past. It was a wound too deep to be constantly reopened. Instead, they spoke of the present. She would tell him of the town's small news, of the arrival of the telegraph, of the children who now played in the streets, blissfully unaware of the blood that had once soaked the ground beneath their feet. He would tell her of the mountains, of the births and deaths among his small, hidden band of people, of the changing seasons in the high country. Their time together was not one of fiery passion, but of a quiet, profound connection that had been tempered and strengthened by years of separation. It was the simple, desperate intimacy of a hand held in the darkness. It was a shared meal of bread and dried meat, eaten in the soft glow of a single candle. It was the comfort of his presence, a solid, living warmth beside her in the vast, lonely silence of her life. He would always be gone before the first hint of dawn, melting back into the mountains, leaving her with the scent of sage and wood smoke on her pillow and the strength to face the silent months ahead. Their love, born in violence and defiance, had survived. It had become a thing of shadows and whispers, a secret as wild and untamable as the desert itself, a timeless legend living and breathing in the heart of a world that had long since moved on. The world had spun on, relentless and indifferent. The year 1920 arrived in Dust Creek not on horseback, but in a sputtering black Ford automobile that backfired like a gunshot and left a trail of oily smoke in its wake. The telegraph office now had a telephone, a strange device that carried disembodied voices across the wires. Electric lights, a novelty that cast a harsh, buzzing yellow glow, had begun to replace the soft flicker of lanterns along the main street. The Old West was dying, its violent, passionate history fading into the sepia tones of memory, becoming stories told by old men on front porches. In the small adobe house at the edge of town, time had moved differently. It had followed the slow, patient rhythm of a solitary heart. Evelyn Hart, now 74, lay in the simple bed that had been her sanctuary for nearly 4 decades. Her body was frail, a delicate bird-bone thing beneath the patchwork quilt, but her eyes, though faded, were as clear as they had been the day she first arrived in this harsh and beautiful land. Her world had shrunk to the 4 walls of this room, but it was not an empty world. On the mantel above the small fireplace, a lifetime of silent messages was arrayed like a treasure. There were the crescent moons of cholla cactus, now brittle and dark with age. There were raven feathers, smooth river stones, and a single, perfectly preserved desert primrose he had left for her one spring morning 30 years ago. They were the artifacts of a secret kingdom, the testament to a love that had outlasted an entire era. Her breathing was shallow, each inhalation a small, determined effort. The Newtown doctor, a young man named Alistair Finch with a neat mustache and a belief in the certainties of modern science, had been that morning. He had spoken to her in low, respectful tones of a failing heart and the body's natural course. He had left her a bottle of laudanum for the pain, but she had not touched it. She wanted to be clear. She was waiting. He came in the late afternoon, when the sun slanted low, filling the room with a soft, golden light. He did not knock. The door, which was never locked, simply opened, and he was there. Nathan Lohman was an old man now, a figure who seemed to have been carved from the ancient, weathered wood of a lightning-struck juniper tree. His copper skin was a fine web of deep lines, each one a story of a day lived under the sun and a night under the stars. His hair was a mane of pure, startling white, tied back in the same simple way he had always worn it. He was stooped, and he walked with the slow, careful gait of one whose joints ached with the memory of a hard life. But his eyes, his dark crow eyes, were unchanged. They held the same fierce intelligence, the same profound depth, the same unwavering love that she had seen across a dusty street all those years ago. He moved to her bedside, his worn moccasins making no sound on the wooden floor. He knelt, taking her hand in his. Her hand was a fragile, translucent thing, all bone and paper-thin skin, but her grip, though weak, was steady. They did not speak. There was nothing left to say that had not been said in 1,000 moonless nights, in 1,000 silent gestures. All that remained was this final, quiet communion. Dr. Finch, making his evening rounds, paused in the open doorway. He saw his patient, the quiet, reclusive old seamstress, holding hands with an ancient Indian man who looked as though he had stepped out of a history book. The doctor was a kind man, and he saw only a final, tender farewell. He did not know he was witnessing the end of a legend. He gave a quiet, respectful nod and backed away, leaving them to their peace. Nathan watched her, his gaze never leaving her face. He saw the flicker of pain she tried to hide, the gentle sigh of her breath as it grew softer. He knew the time had come. He began to sing, The song was not for the living. It was an Apache farewell, a chant for the journey of the soul. His voice, once a low baritone, was now a reedy, cracked whisper. But it held the weight of all his years, of all his love and his loss. It was a sound from another world, a melody as ancient as the red rocks and the desert wind. It spoke of the spirit's release, of a return to the earth, of a journey beyond the pain of memory to a place where all is peace. The song filled the small room, a final, sacred blessing, a bridge of sound built between his world and hers, a bridge they could now cross together. Evelyn listened, a look of profound peace settling on her features, the lines of pain on her forehead smoothed, her breathing eased. This song was his final gift, a piece of his soul that would travel with her into the great silence. She squeezed his hand one last time, her lips forming his name in a breathy, inaudible whisper. And then, as the last note of the ancient song faded into the twilight, she closed her eyes and was gone. Nathan remained kneeling beside her for a long time, her hand still held in his, its warmth slowly fading. The grief that washed over him was not a storm, but a quiet, deep tide, the culmination of a lifetime of loving and waiting. He had outlived his people, he had outlived his era, and now he had outlived his love. He gently placed her hand on the quilt, leaned down, and pressed a final, reverent kiss to her forehead. Then, as silently as he had arrived, he stood and walked out of the door, not looking back. He did not return to the mountains. His journey was over. He walked a mile out of the town, to a place on a low rise where a great saguaro cactus stood, its arms raised to the sky like a silent sentinel. It was a place from which he could see the small adobe house where his heart had lived for 40 years. He sat at the base of the giant cactus, his back resting against its ribbed trunk, and he began his final watch. He did not eat, he did not drink. He simply sat, his gaze fixed on the distant house as the sun set and the stars emerged, a vast, cold, and beautiful tapestry. He sat as the sun rose again, and as it set once more. He was surrendering himself to the land, to the great spirit his mother had taught him to honor, his life force ebbing away with the slow, patient rhythm of the desert. On the morning of the third day, a young boy chasing a jackrabbit found him. He was sitting upright, his white hair stirred by the gentle breeze, his open, unseeing eyes still fixed on the horizon, toward her home. The story of Nathan and Evelyn did not end with their deaths. In a place like Dust Creek, a story that old doesn't die, it just sinks into the ground and comes back up as legend. The townsfolk buried him in an unmarked grave in the potter's field, the strange old Indian who had come to sit with the seamstress at the end. But the old tales, the whispers of the ghost who visited on moonless nights, took on a new life. It was said that on the darkest nights of the year, when the sky was a black velvet void, if you looked out into the desert from the edge of town, you might see them, two figures, walking hand in hand across the sand. One was a tall, shadowy man, the other a smaller, luminous woman, a figure of faint, silvery light. They would walk in a comfortable silence, their forms sometimes clear, sometimes wavering like heat shimmer, before finally dissolving into the vast, silent darkness. They were light and shadow, order and wilderness, reconciled at last, two souls who had found their own time and their own place, beyond the harsh judgment of the world. It was said that no one is born to love the wrong person, only at the wrong time. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please drop a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Tales, and give this video a like. And to help this story reach more listeners, please support us by hitting the hype button. Your support means the world to us.